In this demo, we'll show how to deploy a Windows 10 image using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2013 Update 2. This demo goes over as a continuation of our original demo on how to create a reference image. So if you've already created your reference image, now's the time to take that image and deploy it. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to configure Active Directory permissions in order for our device to be able to join the domain during the imaging process. The steps here outline a recommended way to create that domain join account, although this leverages a script that will set the execution policy, or rather it will set the OU permissions such that this account, this MDT underscore JD account, will be able to join the domain. There is actually a better way to do this than specifying a script to allow an account to go to a specific OU. And that is actually using delegation permissions within Active Directory. So if we look at our domain controller here, our domain controller, if we right-click on it and select Delegate Control, you have the ability here under the Delegate Control wizard to specify an account that has the permissions to join the domain. So if I just do a search here for domain join, I've got an account that's already created. It's called DJ. And if I click next through here, I then have the ability to delegate a common task to this account. And one of those tasks is join a computer to the domain. So this will allow this account to join to any location within the domain. Now, this script that the guide mentions here will only allow you to join to a specific or a target OU. Now you can customize the script to allow multiple OUs, but this is one way of doing it, and then delegate control through Active Directory is a separate way of doing things. So use whichever method makes sense for your environment. The next step is to create a new deployment share. Now in the prior demo, we showed that you can create multiple deployment shares, and the deployment share that was created in the prior demo was the deployment share for creating a reference image. We don't recommend that you use the same deployment share for doing both. So in this case, we actually will create a brand new deployment share for your production. And in this case, we actually will call this the production deployment share. So I'm on my MDT server, and I'm going to create a brand new deployment share by opening the deployment workbench, which if you do not have this open already, go to your Start menu, go to the All Apps view, and scroll over to the deployment workbench. And once it's open, go under Deployment Shares, right-click, and select New Deployment Share. And then save or create the deployment share in a location that makes sense. In this case, I'm going to create a MDT production folder. And I'm going to give a share name of MDT production. And the $sign just keeps the share hidden, like I mentioned in the prior video that we did on capturing your reference image. And we'll call this MDT production. And we'll just keep the defaults. And our deployment share has been created. Our next step in the demo is to go through and add a custom image. So this image is going to be the image that we captured in our prior demo for our reference image. On our MDT server, if we go back to our other deployment share, in the prior demo we did deployment share 3, we should see our captured image from the prior demo. So this is the image that we want to deploy. Let's open up the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and import our operating system image. So we'll select the MDT production deployment share. and the operating system's node, right-click and select Import Operating System. And for the OS type, we want to select Custom Image File, and then we want to specify our source file. So under Deployment Share 3, Captures, and then the WIM file that we captured. In this case, I want to move the files because I don't need this file in that location anymore. And then I'll just take Next. And for the destination directory name, I'll change this. Windows 10, 15, 11, Education, x64. So I'm just putting the name and the version number of the operating system and the date that the operating system was captured. So now the operating system has been imported, and we're ready to move on to the next step. The next step in the process of deploying our image is going to include adding an application. Now you might have multiple applications that you want to deploy. In this demo, we'll be doing, the demo guide here shows to use Adobe Reader. However, I'll be using 7-zip, but the applications that you use could be completely different. You might not even include Adobe Reader, you can include something else. In our MDT environment, I've already copied over 7-zip. I've just downloaded this from the internet and copied this to my eApplications 7-zip folder. And you'll notice that this is an executable. You might find that you will have multiple applications. Some will be EXEs, others will be MSIs. And what you'll want to do before you import the application is make sure that you understand what the silent install switches are for that app. If you don't know the silent switches, you can do a search on the internet. There are a number of websites out there that people post on to share what silent install switches that they've found. Oftentimes you could even just open a command prompt and type in the executable name with a /? and that'll show you what the switches are for that application if you can't find them. If they are MSI based, typically using a /q works. There are a number of other MSI related switches that you can use just depending on the application. So in our MDT deployment share, under the MDT production share, right-click on Applications and select New Application. And we'll want to take the first option here of Application with Source Files. And for application name, we'll just call this 7-zip. And for the source directory, we will go to our E drive, go to Applications, and 7-zip. And I'm not going to move the files, I'm going to keep them here, so we'll just copy these files from the application 7-zip folder into the deployment share. And I'll just take Next here. And for our command line, we need to go back to the file and copy the file name. And for 7-zip, the silent install switch is a /S. Make sure you have it as a capital S and not a lowercase s. Otherwise, the switch will not work. And now our application has successfully been added to the deployment share. Our next step is to create the driver source structure in the file system. And the driver source structure will essentially be we'll make a folder called E drivers. And inside of that, we will create a number of folders for Windows PE, both x86 and x64, as well as Windows 10 x64. If you're using 32-bit Windows 10, then you do that as well. On our MDT server, we have the E drivers folder created, and we've already created the Windows PE folders as well as the Windows 10 x64 folder. Now, one thing to note about Windows PE is Windows PE is what runs your boot image. So when you boot off of your boot image, you're running Windows PE. And the PE versions that come out with the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, or the Windows ADK, include some fairly recent inbox drivers that contain support for nearly all the hardware that's out there at the time of the ADK being released. And each new version of Windows 10 will have a new version of the Windows ADK, which will include a new version of Windows PE. So what this basically means is you won't really have to worry so much about importing drivers because Windows PE should have most of the drivers that most people will need. However, you might end up purchasing newer hardware, and new hardware may not have the latest drivers that PE has. So you want to make sure that, first of all, you're using the latest version of the Windows ADK whenever you're imaging, unless there are some known issues with that cause problems within your environment. But generally speaking, you'll want to use the latest version of the Windows PE that's available in the latest Windows ADK. And if you have newer hardware and you just don't have a driver that's baked in there, then you will have to add new drivers into your boot image in order for that to work. So in my environment, I don't have anything in these Windows PE folders. But if you have drivers you need to put, we recommend you put storage and you put network drivers in there only. You don't want to have your Windows PE including lots of different drivers like audio and video and things like that. You really only want what's necessary because you want your boot image to be as small as possible. The larger the boot image, the longer the time it takes to load that boot image to finally get into MDT to start doing your actual imaging. So smaller is better when it comes to boot image size. Now, as far as our drivers are concerned for Windows 10, inside of our Windows 10 x64 folder, I have created a folder called Microsoft. And if you have other models, then you'll want to include a folder for Dell, Lenovo, HP. And if we drill into the Microsoft folder, we have our Surface Pro 3 and our Surface Pro 4 folders. So I've got drivers for both that I've downloaded from the internet already. So we'll see here, delete the zip file. We'll see here that I have my Surface Pro 3 Windows 10 drivers, and I've got the folder structure that comes with that. And the same is true for Surface Pro 4. Now in MDT, we need to create a logical driver structure, and this basically is going to go along the same lines of what we saw in the file system folder structure, where we will have a node called out-of-box drivers, and inside of that node, we will have x86, x64 versions of PE, as well as Windows 10 x64, and then we'll have a subfolder underneath for the different hardware platforms that we are using. And one thing to note on the model names that you see here, for Dell, we see that we have a folder called Dell, and then we've got a subfolder for a Latitude E6440. We also have HP with an HP EliteBook 8560W. But for Lenovo, we have Lenovo, and then we have 4178. Well, you've probably noticed, if you ever do any Lenovo imaging, that Lenovo version numbers or model numbers are completely different in Windows compared to what they show on the outside of the device. And what this is mentioning down here is that the folder names were chosen because the actual make and model value that MDT reads is actually from the Windows WMI. So the Windows WMI is the Windows Management Instrumentation, and that essentially think of it kind of like a database that stores some information about Windows. In this case, it actually stores the information about the computer system and the actual name of the device. So we want to just make sure that we're matching the name of the device into what MDT sees here, just so that these both match. So back in our MDT deployment share, let's go ahead and create the folders for Microsoft and Surface Pro devices. So let's right-click on out-of-box drivers and select New Folder, and we'll call this Microsoft. And we'll create another folder, and we'll call this Surface Pro 3. And then we'll right-click the Surface Pro 3 folder, select Import Drivers, and select our driver source directory, which in this case is going to be the E drive, drivers, Windows 10 x64, Surface Pro 3. Our drivers have completed successfully, and we can click Finish and close the wizard. And we'll notice here that we have a number of drivers that have been imported to the node, and you can see the name of the driver, the manufacturer, the version number, and a number of other pieces of information that can be useful when it comes to dealing with the drivers. Our next step is to import the Surface Pro 4 drivers. So we'll want to create a new folder called Surface Pro 4. And then right click and select import drivers. They do the same thing that we did for the Surface Pro 3. Our drivers have successfully been imported, and now we're ready to finish the wizard. And the next step has us go through and create the selection profile for our boot image drivers. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that MDT by default will add any storage and network drivers that you import to your boot images. However, we don't really want all of the storage and network drivers because, like I mentioned earlier, Windows PE typically has everything that we need. So what you can do in MDT is create an advanced configuration called selection profiles. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So under advanced configuration, expand that and select selection profiles. And under here, you will notice that we have everything, all drivers and packages, all packages or nothing. And then there's a sample here. And these are all built in. I didn't create any of these on my own. When we right click on one of these and select properties, we'll see that this selection profile for everything does what you would expect it to do. It has everything selected from MDT. But some things have just all drivers or drivers and packages or packages. So if we select all drivers, we will see that all of the different drivers have been selected for us automatically. So we need to create a brand new selection profile. So let's right click on selection profiles and select new selection profile. And for the selection profile name, we'll call this WinPE x86. And then we'll select our out-of-box drivers for, actually we need to create the x86 folder. So let's go under out-of-box drivers, create a new folder called WinPE x86. And we'll create another folder called WinPE x64. And then let's create a new selection profile, call it WinPE x86, and associate that with our WinPE x86 here. And then let's make another selection profile called WinPE x64, and select WinPE x64 here, and select Finish. Our next step is to create the deployment task sequence. So on our MDT server, let's go to the Task Sequences node, right-click, and select New Task Sequence. Give your task sequence an ID, the number doesn't matter, and we'll call this Windows 10 11 Education x64 deployment. For our task sequence template, we want to use standard client task sequence. Select our operating system. And for product key, do not specify a product key. And for our organization, just call this whatever your organization is. And specify a local administrator password if necessary. At the summary screen, we can go ahead and click Next. And at the confirmation screen, we can click Finish. So now we have our task sequence. The next step is to add, or actually edit, the Windows 10 task sequence to allow us to dynamically apply the drivers depending on the make and the model of the device. Now earlier I imported drivers for Surface Pro 3 and Surface Pro 4. What we will be doing is creating a new task sequence variable, and the task sequence variable will be called driver group 001. This is a variable that MDT understands, and what it will do is it will have a value of Windows 10 x64, which is the folder name that we created within MDT, and then it'll have a variable called make, and then another variable called model. And this basically aligns with the folder structure that we created earlier. By setting this, the following step, which is inject drivers, will read the value that is in driver group 001 and then know that it needs to use the drivers that are specified within this folder path in MDT. So let's see how that looks. So under task sequences, and let's select our task sequence and go to Properties. And select the Task Sequence tab at the top and pre-install under the folder structure, the group structure within the task sequence. Under the Enable BitLocker Offline step, add a new general set task sequence variable step. We'll call this set driver group 001. Just going to copy from the guide and paste this in for the value. So this is basically telling the inject driver step to install the drivers from this location within MDT. So we'll want to apply that. And for my task sequences, I like to always put custom in front so I know where I have made changes within the task sequence. Now the next step in the inject drivers step is to change this so all drivers isn't selected, because if we use this, then it'll do plug and play matching within the out-of-box drivers node. So it'll try to match against any driver that's in here. So if you want to be precise in terms of which drivers you install, we don't want it to just match and find any driver within the deployment share. So we set this to nothing. And by setting this to nothing, it's not going to use any of the selection profiles. What it will do is it will use the driver group 001 that we've specified here. And this way you have more control over how your drivers get installed on your device. And I'm just going to modify this to say custom so I know that I've changed that. And then we also want to add Windows Update so it will install any updates that are applicable to the device. And I'll enable both of these. And then the last step is I'm going to add a step here to install my application that I imported for 7-zip. And I'm going to call this install 7-zip. Our next step is to go through and configure the deployment share by configuring the rules and the bootstrap INI settings. If you remember in the reference image demo, we went through copying in the custom settings INI or the rules settings from that guide. If you do that, a lot of the wizard is already pre-populated for you because you're doing that through the rules. So you're saying that these settings must always apply. Sometimes though, that puts you in somewhat of a bind because it's fairly static, saying that you use the same domain admin account, you use the same domain join account, or the same exact settings every single time, and that just might not work within your environment. So it really depends on your environment on how you want to handle these rules. What I'm going to do in the demo, though, is I'm going to go through and actually not specify all of these settings. I'm going to specify some of them, but not all of them. And our next step is to go into the deployment share and rename our Windows PE images, as well as enable monitoring for the deployment share. So back on the deployment share, we'll right click on our deployment share and select properties and go to Windows PE, and we will rename this to MDT production Windows PE and MDT production x86. And we'll do that for the x64 media as well. And for our boot media, we can also modify the selection profile. This is what we created earlier. And we can specify that we want to use x86. And then for x64, we want to do the same thing. This way, we don't get all of the drivers that are storage and network automatically added. We'll only get whatever's in the PE selection profile. And right now, there's nothing in that profile. So there aren't any drivers that will be imported into our boot images. And this is really just going to save you a lot of space when it comes time to dealing with your boot media. And then we also want to go and select under the monitoring tab, the enable monitoring for this deployment share. And looking at our rules, I do want to add one rule into here, and that's just to specify my WSUS server. This way, when I deploy this image, if there are any additional updates that aren't included in my image, I can get these updates directly from my WSUS server. Now, in the last demo, when we did the reference image capture, we specified a WSUS server in there. Now, if you use the same WSUS server all the time, then you can use the exact same device or the exact same WSUS server in this list here. If you use a different production WSUS server versus the one that you use for capturing images, then you want to make sure that you're including your production WSUS server here. I'm using the same WSUS server, but again, you might have a different one. And I also won't be adding any other of those rules that we saw in the guide here, only because I want you to actually see what the wizard looks like without a lot of this stuff. But just know that you can always go and add different rules into that rules tab to speed up your deployment process or remove wizards that you don't think, or wizard pages that you don't think your end users or your technicians will need to see. So now I'll click OK to save my rules and my WinPE and the monitoring settings. Next step in the guide has us go through and add Dart to the boot images. And Dart is a tool that comes with the Microsoft Desktop Optimization Package, MDOP. If you're an active software assurance subscriber, if you're an education customer and you have a valid EES agreement, you typically have Windows SA. If you have software assurance, then you have the ability to get Dart. And Dart allows you to include some additional tools that can help you to troubleshoot either issues with Windows itself or issues with your deployment that could go wrong. So there are some steps here. I'm not going to include these in my image, but if you wanted to do this, there are steps that you can follow here in order to add that. And next we have the update of the deployment share. So this will allow us to update and process the changes that we've made to our WinPE boot images. So to update our deployment share, we need to right-click on MDT production and select Update Deployment Share, and just keep the defaults. And again, this process can take a little while if you remember from our prior video. So the boot image creation process has completed, and now we are ready to finish the wizard of updating the deployment share. And the next step in the process here is to deploy the Windows 10 client image. Now you have multiple ways of deploying your image. You can use an ISO or a DVD or a USB stick and take your boot media that you just created through updating of the deployment share. And we can take that media and put it on a USB drive and pop it into a machine and deploy. But there are better ways of doing things, and you can leverage Windows deployment services. So this guide goes through and shows how you can add your boot images to Windows deployment services, but one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't show you how to install Windows deployment services. It makes the assumption that WDS has already been installed. To install Windows deployment services, it's rather simple. Just go into Server Manager on your MDT server or any server that you plan on using Windows deployment services on, and select Add Roles and Features, and click on Next, and you can take Next for a lot of this wizard here. And under the server roles, we want to select Windows Deployment Services, and just add Features, and click Next, and click Next, and Next again. And then we'll see the role services for WDS that get installed, and then click on Install. When installation has succeeded, go ahead and click Close, and now Windows Deployment Services is on your server. To access Windows Deployment Services from Server Manager, you can click on Tools and select Windows Deployment Services. Once you have Windows Deployment Services open, you'll want to expand servers and select your server. And the first thing you want to do is configure that server. So right-click on the server and select Configure. And it's going to give you some prerequisites that need to be here. You need to be a part of a Active Directory domain services domain. You also need to have a DHCP server on the network, as well as a DNS server, and you'll have to have some file space on your server in order to store your images. We need to specify the location of where we want to store our boot images and our install images and the other associated files that Windows Deployment Services needs. That's the remote install folder. I'm going to put this on the E drive. And then we have some PXE settings that we can configure here. We can specify to not respond to any client computers, respond only to known client computers, and respond to all client computers. And known clients are clients that have been pre-staged, and that's what this node, you might notice that here, Active Directory pre-staged devices. So you might have devices that are brand new and you don't want to take the time to go and pre-stage all your AD pre-staged devices here, so you can select respond to all client computers, known and unknown. The configuration has finished, and now we're ready to add images to the server. So here we can add our files here. Actually, I'm going to cancel out of this, and we'll go back to the guide and follow what the guide is telling us to do. It's essentially just telling us where do we want to include our boot images. You can also include install images as well. However, you won't really leverage your MDT task sequence. You would be leveraging just what's baked into the image file. So what we want to do is we want to just add a boot image, and this way we can boot off of our MDT server, use this boot image off the network, but then that boot image will then point us to our MDT server, which in this case it's all stored on the same box. But you might have WDS servers that are all over the place, and you could boot directly off of that WDS server, and then it'll point to a separate MDT server. It really depends on the configuration within your environment. So here we can select boot images and right-click on it and select Add Boot Image, and then specify the location of our boot image file. So in this case, we'll go to our deployment share. and select boot. And in this case, we need to use our x64 based image files. And we'll see here that we have MDT production WinPE x64, and we'll just leave that at default. And our boot image has successfully been added to the server. Our next step is to go through and deploy the Windows 10 client, and we need to do this to a virtual machine in Hyper-V. Let's create a brand new virtual machine. Select in Hyper-V, select New and Virtual Machine, and we'll go through the wizard here. We'll call this Win10 edu deploy. And I'll store this on my E drive. I will make this a Generation 2 virtual machine. Generation 2 allows for support for UEFI-based firmware as well as support for security features such as Secure Boot. For my memory, I will add 2 gigs, and I will turn off dynamic memory. For my connection, I will select my wired network, and I will create the virtual disk. And I will install an operating system later. Now, I could just install from an ISO file, and I could use the MDT boot media that it created, but I want to actually boot this off of the network. So I can either select install an operating system later, or I can say install an operating system from a network-based installation server. I'll just select later, and then finish. And then I can right-click and select connect. And I just want to look at settings real quick, make sure everything is good. I'm booting off of the network adapter as my first network device, but I want to change the processors to 2 processors. And then we'll start the VM. And once DHCP server negotiation completes, you should see a message here that the client IP, the server IP, you just want to hit enter here. And then by hitting enter, it will boot to your MDT server and download the boot media. Now that the boot media has been downloaded, we can run the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit deployment wizard. Now, when you don't specify any credentials in the bootstrap INI file, this is the credential prompt that you will get. So for this deployment share and this boot media, we have our task sequence for the Windows 10 1511 Education x64 deployment. So we'll select that and click Next. And then there are some computer details that we need to pass. So in this case, we can pass what the computer name is going to be. And we can join to the domain. And we can specify an organizational unit. If you don't specify one, then it will still join it. And we'll go to, we have our credentials that we've already passed earlier, although I can use that domain join account that I mentioned earlier. And then we have settings. If you want to move user data and settings, you have that option. Although on this computer, because it's a brand new machine, it's not seeing any previous installation of Windows. So there's nothing for it to restore. So I'll just hit next to the rest of this. I will not enable BitLocker. and I will begin the installation. Now this installation can take a little bit of time, so we'll pause the video here and wait for it to finish the deployment. And while the deployment is going on, you can also use the MDT 2013 monitoring feature. So if we go to our MDT server under monitoring, we can see that we have a machine, and this is the name that I typed in for that machine, and we can see the status that it is currently running. And we can see the step that it's on and the percent that it's complete and the elapsed time. So this gives you an easy way of seeing what devices are being imaged at any given time within your environment and the current status of that process. The deployment of our operating system has completed successfully. We're now ready to click Finish. And this is logged in with the local administrator account. And we can now reboot this device and see that it joined the domain. So the device has now been rebooted, and we can log in with a domain account. We are now logged into the VM, and we can see that our start menu is here. And if we go and right-click on the Start button and select System, we will see that we are joined to the domain. And if we go into the All Apps view, we will see that 7-zip is installed successfully. If we go back to the monitoring feature of MDT, we'll see that the status is flagged as completed for this device, and we'll see how long it took, which was 15 minutes. We'll also notice that if you use the event viewer within the MDT server, you'll see event notifications about deployments completing successfully for the computers that are imaging against your MDT server. And through the rest of this guide, there are some additional things that you can do, but I'm not going to be showing them in the demo. For instance, multicast deployments. Multicast allows for image deployment with reduced network load during multiple deployments. But you have to have your network enabled for this. So there are some requirements that you'll need to work with your networking team to make sure that multicast is set up successfully prior to installing it and configuring it for Windows deployment services. There's also some steps in here to go over offline media and deploying Windows 10. In some environments, your network might not be up to task to deploy Windows 10 or really any version of Windows just due to the size of the images. In this case, you can create offline media, and there are some steps here on how to do that. And it's much better to demo and see how this works when you have physical hardware as opposed to doing it through virtual machines. And lastly, UEFI. So if you're not aware, UEFI is the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or UEFI, and this is what most devices are coming nowadays with. And if you haven't been using MDT or SCCM, you probably have been trying to manually create the partitioning format that UEFI requires. MDT will do all of that work for you. In fact, if you saw and paid attention to when I did the image of the Hyper-V guest, the machine I used was a Generation 2 virtual machine. That Generation 2 virtual machine is based off of a UEFI BIOS. And that UEFI has a specific partitioning format that it needs, and MDT created all of that for me. And this concludes the demonstration on how to deploy with MDT 2013 Update 2.